This webinar is brought to you by the Chugach Regional Resources Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. My name is Sydney Filkey. I'm the Regional Wetlands Coordinator for Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'll be doing my best to moderate the webinar this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I think everyone that is presenting today is more than willing to answer questions as we move along. Also in your Zoom window, you should have an opportunity to use the chat function. So be on the lookout for that. And if you're not comfortable asking questions or out loud, or you just want to kind of send out a question to the group, feel free to use the chat function to email messages directly to everyone that's on the group or to the speaker in particular. With that, I want to give just a brief introduction and thank you to our presenters today. As I mentioned, my name is Sydney Filkey and I'm the Regional Wetlands Coordinator for Fish and Wildlife Service. I've been with Fish and Wildlife Service for just over a year in this position. Prior to that, I worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Palmer and the Bureau of Land Management in Wyoming. I was born and raised down in Homer, Alaska, and I'm excited to be here today. Additionally, we will have presenters give their brief biographies when they present, but just to give you an idea of who will be coming up later today. Christy Harper and Ryan Maroney with the Natural Resources Conservation Service have put together their presentation. I believe Ryan will be delivering that to you today. Marcia here with the Environmental Protection Agency will be talking about wetland program development grants, and Willow Hetrick and Rachel Fisher with the Chugach Regional Resources Commission will be talking to you about their experience with the wetland program development grant, and they're developing their wetland program plan as well. With that, I want to kick today's presentations off with a discussion about mapping Alaska's wetlands and the role of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in that particular process. So just to get started, if you're not really familiar with the importance and the role of wetlands from an ecological services perspective, there's a lot of reasons why wetlands have specific protections to them. There's specific permitting requirements. And in terms of what they do in the environmental landscape, there's a lot of documented values for wetlands. These include water filtration. A lot of people describe wetlands, especially peatlands, as a sponge that pulls out contaminants and filters water as it moves through the landscape. Wetlands offer temperature moderation. So there's a lot of research going on right now in terms of how wetlands provide a lot of shading and can keep waters cool and deliver a cool temperature to warming waters on the landscape. There's a variety of habitats that species that are specifically developed to live in wetland environments. They also offer erosion control from flooding and storm surges, stream flow moderation, where they provide consistent water flow to keep a stream from drying up, and also a lot of carbon sequestration, as I mentioned before with the peatlands, where we have the deep, spongy wetlands that a lot of us are familiar with. In terms of the importance of wetlands data and information, the importance of that comes to, well, we're trying to plan activities across the landscape. Alaska has extensive wetlands. Over 40% of the state is covered by wetlands, and we need the information of where wetlands are on the landscape in order to help plan our projects, especially in the beginning phases, to know what's the best location for a road, an oil and gas development. If we're looking at water and wastewater treatment facilities, where might those be best placed on a landscape surrounding a community? We also want to know where wetlands are in terms of what might be the most important subsistence habitats we want to protect and conserve. And then a lot of research going into where might we have carbon sequestration and blue carbon credit opportunities that are just really starting to be evaluated across Alaska. So we have a lot of reasons where not only do we know that wetlands offer a lot of value to our environment, but by knowing exactly where those wetlands are in the landscape, they can help us better plan development activities across our landscapes. In order to complete the wetland mapping process, it's an integration of a lot of what we call remotely sensed information to develop a picture of the landscape in terms of where water is collected and stored and where water flows off. This also contributes to the vegetation types that are present and the different soils on the landscape. And so in order to map wetlands and create a map of the different types across the landscape, mappers tend to use elevation products and imagery inputs, and they combine that information with vegetation, soil survey, and stream hydrography information where available, and basically draw out lines to delineate the different types of features on a landscape. This is also supplemented with field work where there's, for any given wetland inventory, a significant amount of checkpoints and checking out what the actual conditions are on the ground to make sure that the photo interpreters have properly described the different wetlands on the landscape. So this gets to the wetlands inventory. And what that is it's a geospatial data set managed by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And its purpose is to document the extent and type of wetlands and deep water habitats at a landscape scale across the country. So a really important caveat to this data set is that it's considered a planning tool. This is not the regulatory data set that some folks might be familiar with when they're actually putting site-specific markings right on the ground. So what I have here is an image of the landscape up off of the Chugach Valley, and you can see that the yellow lines are what are delineating the different type of wetlands on the landscape. And if we were to zoom in further to this picture, we could definitely provide a lot more detail to that particular image. But for the purpose of the National Wetland Inventory, we're creating a planning tool that generalizes the wetlands across the environment. And so that's really what the goal of the National Wetlands Inventory is to take those ecological services that wetlands provide and basically lump and split them across the landscape to create a map that can be used for planning for all of those different infrastructures and development projects that I talked about before. So the National Wetlands Inventory is the most widely used wetlands data set across the country because it is consistent throughout most states except for Alaska. In Alaska, we have only about 42% of the state has been inventoried at this point in time. So the map that you're seeing on the screen right now, the dark green represents areas where we have National Wetlands Inventory data available, and the light green represents areas where we do not have National Wetlands Inventory information available. And then the other colors ranging from gray to brown to black represent different types of existing or potential infrastructure that is easily accessible information across the state. And so what you can see by this map is that the NWI data was produced extensively throughout the infrastructure development across the state to support the decision-making that needed to happen in those landscapes. But as infrastructure has continued to expand, the wetland inventory and mapping information has not kept up with that. And so what my program is trying to do is move our mapping projects forward so that we can complete this mapping project across the entire state and turn all of those light green areas dark green over time. We're being somewhat successful with that at this point. As I said, 42% of the state has existing national wetlands inventory data. That tends to be along the road system, the coastlines, and areas where infrastructure has been developed consistently over the last 40 years. We have 17% of the state in progress with existing inventories right now. So the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation are funding various projects to expand our national wetland inventory footprint across the state. But we still have 41% of the state that we don't have a plan in place or a financial plan in place for completing this inventory. And part of that is because it's expensive to complete. Production costs range between 1 cent and 10 cents per acre, depending on the level of detail for any particular project. But there are a couple of different groups that are working to pursue statewide coverage of this wetlands information across the state. That includes the Alaska Wetlands Technical Working Group, which is a state organized group of both federal, state, and private partners that have produced a strategy to specify that the National Wetlands Inventory should be completed statewide. And they've specified that it should be completed, or they would like to see it completed within the next 10 years. In order to do that, we need to work on building partnerships to expand our mapping opportunities. That includes presentations like we're giving today to try and get the word out regarding what are the different opportunities for individual communities or groups to pursue mapping on their own and not wait for the Fish and Wildlife Service or the state or BLM to map their particular region. And so we're looking at partnerships. We're also evaluating ways to control costs. That includes mapping at different resolutions across the landscape. So communities might want higher detailed information so that they can make more robust planning decisions about where they would like to see transportation infrastructure or water and wastewater treatment plants, etc. On large expanses of wilderness, we might be just more interested in information related to general habitat suitability, maybe for subsistence species or just kind of vegetation information in general. And so we might not need the same level of detail. And that really, by evaluating those trade-offs, we can really control the costs of moving this project forward. But in general, what we expect the total cost for this project to be by the time we complete the state is somewhere between $2.5 and $7 million. So there's one potential partner funding opportunity that I actually had thought had closed, and it has not closed for this year. And those are the Tribal Fish and Wildlife Services, or the Tribal Fish and Wildlife grants that are available through the Fish and Wildlife Service. I will copy and paste this link in the chat after this presentation. But those Tribal Fish and Wildlife grants provide a competitive funding opportunity for federally recognized tribal governments. And they're really looking at projects that are going to develop and implement programs that are benefiting wildlife and their habitat. And this is not specific to species that are hunted and fished. So historically, these have really been focused on a lot of restoration activities, but I have found that in 2019, 2 tribes on the Wind River Indian Reservation were awarded a grant to support wetland mapping and assessment tools. And I think that really opens the door for additional applications related to developing baseline information like a wetland inventory that can go on to help a tribal government manage and plan their wetland resources. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity application period for this has been extended to July 6th, 2020. And so at this point, we still have some time if anybody is interested in putting together a grant request for that. And so I can provide additional information like I said, I'm not the one who administers this grant, and so I only recently learned about it, but just wanted to make sure folks were aware that this is an opportunity that is out there, and folks might consider using that for some type of, applying for that for some type of wetland mapping opportunities. And so with that, that was just a really quick overview of what the National Wetlands Inventory Program is and why wetlands are important for not only their ecological services, but also to help assist with planning activities to make sure projects are sited in locations that will be successful. And I would be happy to answer any questions before I turn the mic over to Ryan Maroney. All right, if anybody has any questions, we'll have additional time at the end for some additional discussion. And so with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Ryan.
Thanks, Sydney. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Maroney, and I'm the Alaska Native Technical Liaison for the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service is a unique federal agency with the sole mission of helping people help the land, which essentially means working with private landowners to provide voluntary conservation assistance, whether that's technical or financial assistance to help address resource concerns on those individuals' private lands. I work with Christy Harper, who is the Alaska Native Liaison, and we both work out of the Palmer State Office. And USDA NRCS got its start in the Dust Bowl days. During what was arguably the largest human-caused environmental catastrophe that resulted from unsustainable farming practices. And Congress recognized the importance of private landowners managing their soil and the moisture resources that soil preserves and regulates, as Sydney was mentioning before. And the Soil Conservation Service was established. We used to be called the Soil Conservation Service and have changed our name since. But essentially, the agency provides assistance to private landowners. And in Alaska, private land is a big deal. There's 45 million acres approximately of privately owned land in the state. And of those 45 million acres, I understand approximately 44 million acres are owned and managed by Alaska Native entities, specifically Alaska Native corporations. And so it's not surprising that in Alaska, USDA NRCS works hand in hand with many partners, including Alaska Native entities, to provide conservation assistance on those lands. One of the ways we work with Alaska Native entities in the state is through Alaska Tribal Conservation Districts, which are essentially similar to a state soil and water conservation district, if you're familiar with those. And it's a public-private partnership that helps provide guidance and focus to USDA as we try to cater our assistance to best meet the needs in those regions. And so this map here currently shows the 18 Alaska tribal conservation districts that are currently in the state. There are a few that have yet to identify their boundaries, but the number has been increasing steadily over the years. And as an aside, if you're interested in learning more about Alaska tribal conservation districts, how they operate and how to form one, please give me or Christy Harper a call or a shout offline, and we'll be glad to talk with you about that. And there'll be contact information provided at the end of the presentation. So no matter how we're working with our partners, whether they're Alaska Native landowners or just private land operators, we provide our service through a 3-hub service model. So we have a north hub with with an office out of Fairbanks. We have a south hub with an office based out of Kenai, and a central hub that covers not only south central, portions of south central and southeast, with offices in Wasilla and also Juneau. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the things I'll talk about today, this is a quick reference for the key locations to find information. And of course, also there'll be a website provided at the end of the presentation. So no matter however you're working with NRCS, it all starts with a conservation plan before we're able to help identify eligibility and opportunities to provide financial assistance to landowners, or even technical assistance without any dollars connected. It all starts with a conservation plan. In USDA NRCS, we define a conservation plan as a living and evolving document and tool designed to help you better manage the resources on your land. And just like Sydney was mentioning before, resource inventory is critical to making the best decisions for future development and also just efficiencies in operation on your land. And so conservation planning is key. And there's two types of resource data that NRCS provides they're pretty helpful for planning, and I wanted to just highlight two of those today. One is our Alaska Snow Survey, and you can see here on the left-hand side, this is a snow survey report from May. Each month, these hydrologists who work for our snow survey team produce a report providing average data for various basins around the state. And the snow survey program provides mountain snowpack data and stream flow forecasts for the western United States and Alaska. Common applications of snow survey products include water supply management, flood control, climate modeling, recreation, and conservation planning. And if you're interested in more specific information from locations in the state, you can go to our Water and Climate Information Systems interactive map and see the locations around Alaska, as well as other parts of the western states that have snow survey data collection points. Some of these sites are automated, others are manual collection sites where people actually go out with snow tubes and measure snowpack. But that's one resource I wanted to bring to folks' attention. Additionally, we have the agency is known for producing and providing information on soil resources, and our soil survey staff do that in Alaska. On the right, you can see a soil survey report for the western interior rivers area of Alaska. That's the middle Kuskokwim and Yukon region. Now, in the old days, this was all done in a book-like report, and that was produced and printed and distributed. Now it's all online, and up in the top left of that right-hand side of the page, you can see our web soil survey is the online repository of this type of information. The soil survey that NRCS produces is essentially a resource inventory where field scientists collect, organize, and interpret information about the natural resources in an area. And although the main focus is on soils, data is also collected on vegetation, landforms, and surface hydrology. The soil surveys help landowners and communities select the best sites for homes, schools, airfields, roads, landfills, and even future agricultural developments. Soil surveys are very useful in providing a scientific inventory of soil resources, for making maps, identifying physical and chemical properties of soils, as well as supplying current information on potential uses and limitations of soils. And, not surprisingly, and very similar to what Sydney mentioned with the wetland mapping of the state, our soil survey mapping in Alaska has a lot of room to grow. And you can see currently that the blue areas shaded are the certified completed soil survey work that has been done in the state, and the areas in green are the areas in progress. And so, the agency will be working and continues to strive to get the entire map, the entire state mapped, but that will be a work in progress. But if you are interested in information from the locations that are currently in blue, you can go to our web soil survey online source and find detailed information about those areas. So in addition to the snow survey and the soil survey information out there, our agency also goes out and works one-on-one with landowners. And I just wanted to highlight a few very brief types of assistance the agency provides to a landowner based off of doing those conservation planning assessments. We work to help folks in agricultural situations improve their growing season with high tunnels. We have done work with reindeer herders in Norton Sound for prescribed grazing management. We work quite a bit with forest land management and stand improvement in Southeast and also in the interior. The agency has done quite a bit of work with landowners to improve early successional habitat. As you can see in this slide in the left-hand side, that's a very old willow that had grown up out of the reach of moose for browse, and that willow has been cut about 2/3 of the way through and hinged. And the idea there is that the still living stem that's cut will grow new shoots, branches that will come up and be available for the moose. We've done work with landowners and irrigation water management, as you can see on the right there, as well as stream bank protection, and even trail and walkway development, as you can see in the slide on the bottom right. That's in Hooper Bay, where we've worked with the local village corporation there to manage access to areas for subsistence hunting and gathering, and harden a trail to try to control the impacts of ATVs in wetland habitat that's critical for a variety of shorebirds and waterfowl. So no matter how you're working with the agency, if you're a farmer, a rancher, or you're just trying to improve wildlife habitat or address erosion concerns, conservation compliance is essential to be able to receive benefits from the agency. Again, NRCS is a non-regulatory agency that offers voluntary conservation assistance. And one of the cornerstones of participating in USDA programs and receiving benefits from the USDA is compliance with our highly erodible land and wetland conservation requirements. The Food Security Act of 1985 provides that persons are ineligible for benefits under certain USDA programs if that land manager plants a highly erodible field or converts a wetland, essentially drains or somehow changes a natural wetland to produce a crop. And so again, USDA is voluntary and we are non-regulatory, so the types of things I'm talking about here in terms of USDA's concern with a wetland are really specific to the ability of an individual to be eligible to receive benefits. But USDA wetlands are defined as a site that has a predominance of hydric soils, has wetland hydrology, and under normal circumstances supports a prevalence of hydrophytic vegetation. And again, a landowner and operator is responsible for maintaining compliance on all land they have a legal interest in, and they must ensure any planned work activities such as clearing trees, enhancing drainage, filling, etc., do not jeopardize their USDA program eligibility. And so we encourage folks who are working with us to talk with their local NRCS planning staff and prior to making any major developments on their land, if they're interested in maintaining their USDA eligibility. In the bottom right photo, you can see a photo of a wetland determination going on out at Pilgrim Hot Springs outside of Nome. And the types of determinations we do are benefited from having additional resource inventory information. And so You know, local efforts and partner efforts to do wetland mapping are very helpful to support the wetland determinations for USDA program eligibility that NRCS staff do. So I guess with that, I will end the presentation, and I thank you for your time. If you'd like to find out more information about how NRCS in Alaska might be of assistance to you, please go online to our website. You can see the link here, or feel free to contact either myself or Christy Harper, our Alaska Native Liaison, and we'd be glad to talk with you more about what USDA can do for you. So if there's any questions now, I'd be glad to entertain them. Thank you.
Okay, now am I the only one that can't hear anybody?
Nope, I think at this point, Ryan, if you want to unshare, and Marcia here with EPA can take over.
Let's get up my presentation. Okay, just trying to make sure I get the, can you guys see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it, Marcia.
Yep, I see it. Looks
Great.
good.
Okay, I want to get the full screen. Let's see how I do that.
Bottom, in the bottom right of your screen, Marcia, there's a little slide, just one over to the left from the minus sign.
Let's see now, right. Let's see, reading view.
Go to the right there.
Right there, that one?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, hi everybody. My name's Marcia here, and I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency. I've worked up in Alaska really since 1991, and I started my career with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist, and I also I worked for the Corps of Engineers for about 10 years in their wetland permitting program, and now I work with EPA. And most of my career has dealt with wetlands or wetland mapping, and so I know how important that is for what I do and what other people do. Today, though, I'm going to talk about wetland program development grants that EPA has, and I'm going to go over kind of the general information about this grant program, the two different funding cycles, and then wetland program plans, and also Willow's going to be talking about that as well in her presentation. And then also, I'm going to give an example of some awarded grants. Now, let's see. Okay, so the Wetland Program Development Grants, they assist state, tribal, local government agencies, and interstate, intertribal entities in building programs that protect, manage, and restore wetlands. The kind of overall goal of the program is to increase the quantity and quality of wetlands by conserving and restoring the wetland acreage and improving wetland condition. And then within the program, there's what we focus on is 4 core elements, and there's a core element framework for the state and tribal wetland programs. And the 4 things that we focus on are monitoring and assessment, voluntary restoration and protection, regulatory approaches such as compliance and enforcement, and 401 water quality certification, and then also wetland specific water quality standards. And these core elements do periodically change, but for the most part, these 4 items are consistent. So there is kind of 2 different funding opportunities under these wetland program development grants. There's the regional funding, and that is EPA Region 10 is, there's all different regions within the United States, but EPA Region 10 includes Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And when that grant opportunity opens up, it's a competitive process between the states. And the eligible applicants include state, tribal, and local government agencies, as well as interstate, intertribal entities. And it's a 2-year funding cycle, so the solicitations occur every other year. And the next requests for applications will be early in 2021. And then there's also the tribal set-aside opportunities. And the regional opportunity I just talked about is also open to tribes. But this set-aside is right off the top separated out by headquarters from the overall funding. And it has its own requests for application process. And the primary focus is to develop and refine tribal wetland programs. And eligible applicants include tribal governments and intertribal consortia. And this is also a 2-year funding cycle. And the solicitations occur on even years. And the next anticipated date for when the requests for applications would open up is June of 2020. So that's just right around the corner. But from what I understand, the funding likely would not be available for the awarded grants until 2021. This has kind of been a moving target. Initially, we thought it was going to be in January, but for some reason it's gotten delayed. So hopefully that request for applications will come out in June 2020. So. And so the tribes and intertribal consortia are eligible to apply for wetland program development grants under that announcement. And tribes must be federally recognized, although treatment as a state status is not required. And then there's certain regulations under what would be qualify for intertribal consortia, and that's outlined under 40 CFR 35.504. And then one of the questions I previously had asked was, are tribes bounded by geographic limits? Because a lot of the tribes in the lower 48 are bounded by reservation lands, whereas it's not, other than Metlakatla, that's the only reservation in Alaska. For these grants, there are not any geographic limits on if you know, the tribe doesn't own the land, it doesn't mean they couldn't apply for grants and get awarded to conduct grant activities on those lands. And then, so under each of these different grant opportunities, they are divided up into tracks. There's track 1 and track 2. And for the regional funding, the track 1 limits states and tribes that they can only apply for projects that are currently under an approved EPA wetland program plan, or they can apply to develop or update a wetland program plan. And so that's track 1. And track 2 is more open, and that that would be eligible to states, tribes, local governments, universities, interstate agencies, consortiums, and they under this track they can either, you know, put in submittals to develop or refine a wetland program plan, or they could carry out other actions identified under the EPA's core element framework. And I'm going to show you a link at the end of this presentation, but there is just a lot of different examples of what types of projects that could qualify under that core element framework. So it's not just limited to the wetland program plans, but the funding opportunities are less if you're under track 2. If you develop a wetland program plan, then your funding opportunities, there's a lot more available. And so on the tribal set-aside wetland program grants, eligible tribes can submit proposals under track 1 if they're working under a wetland program plan. But they can also apply under track 2 if they're not working under a program wetland plan. But intertribal consortia can only submit proposals under track 2. Even if they have a wetland program plan, they're limited to track 2. And then they, you know, like I say, it's a competitive program, and typically the funding is split. 60% more goes towards the track 1 proposals and 40% to the track 2. And then there's been many wetland program plans that have been developed by both states and tribes. And these plans, they articulate what they want to accomplish with their wetland programs over time. And there's a lot of good examples that are available on our website that help folks understand, you know, what the different types of planning that's being done, and different kinds of projects that they're looking at under their wetland plans. And so, you know, basically these wetland plans, they sort of describe the overall program goals with both broad and specific activities that will help achieve the goals. And the plans can vary between 3 and 6 years, and you know, different time frames will be associated with different activities under the plan. And the yeah, and so there's, like I say, you know, a list of planned activities, and they are consistent with the core element framework that I talked about earlier. And like I say, if a tribe has an EPA approved wetland plan that is current, they can submit applications under the Wetland Program Development Grant application period, and they can apply under both tracks for the funding. And then here's just some examples of different projects that have been funded under the Wetland Program Development Grants. And, you know, basically the foundation of the program is an understanding of the location, extent, and condition of wetland resources. And it's not just limited to wetlands. It is also, you know, there's been several grants for stream type of projects. But there has been several tribal and state projects that have been funded previously for wetland mapping and wetland monitoring projects. There's been grants that apply different types of mapping tools like GIS, infrared photography, modeling, field inspection of soils, vegetation, and hydrology. And, you know, using these tools to develop methodology to help identify and prioritize restorable wetlands. So if, like one example is a tribe that, you know, they have wetlands on their reservation, and they want to be able to map those and prioritize those to see which ones they would like to restore. And then also there's been several grants where they help identify and prioritize management areas so that they can figure out what are the most highest functioning wetlands, or the ones that are getting, you know, hammered by development, and they're the most vulnerable ones. And then they can kind of prioritize like the restoration potential or the protection, which areas they would like to protect in their wetland plan. And so, like I say, there has been many tribes within all Region 10 states that have developed or are developing wetland program plans. And then just to give you some example of projects that aren't eligible, it's not implementation. I know it gets kind of confusing on this. I get confused too, but we don't like fund like something that would be a position in an office that would be, you know, get continuous funding, but it's more a specific task that would help others as well to carry out, to transfer that information and help advance the state of knowledge. And so, like, for example, like I said, if we wouldn't fund like a state or tribal resource program, and we also wouldn't fund a project where you actually conduct the restoration on the ground, because that would fall into implementation. But a project that identifies, prioritizes, or plans for wetland restoration and protection would likely be eligible. Let's see. And then also the non-federal match, 25% is required. But if the grantee has an approved performance partnership grant in place, then the match can be much less. And we also, if any kind of mapping projects are awarded, they have to apply to the standards, that I'm sure Sydney is much more knowledgeable on, but the geospatial data has to be consistent with the Federal Geographic Data Committee endorsed standards. And then that makes it, you know, ensures that once this mapping project is done, it can, you know, qualify for like being under the National Wetland Inventory mapping. And so, you know, when folks are applying for wetland type mapping projects, it's really helpful to have an applied use of that mapping. Not just, you know, we want to map wetlands, but we want to map wetlands because, you know, they're threatened, or, you know, we want to be able to prioritize restoration areas or protection areas. And so it would be geared towards a conservation purpose, not we're mapping because we want to be able to, you know, have future projects in this area that are going to develop or impact the wetlands. And that's pretty much all I had to say. And our website right here has a lot of helpful information. And also here's my contact information, and feel free to email me or give me a call if you have any questions in the future. And also if you have any questions right now.
Thank you very much for that, Martha. A comment from the chat was whether or not these presentations will be available. And yes, we will email out the presentations from today to everyone who attended. So thank you very much, Martha. We'll have more time for questions at the very end, but I am really excited for the next presentation, which is going to be from Willow and Rachel regarding their experience thus far with a wetland program development grant, working on their wetland program plan.
Okay, great, Sydney, thanks. And thanks to Ryan and Marcia for also presenting. Marcia, I was scrambling, taking notes. It was really good. Oh gosh, I jumped to the last page. How did I do that? Sorry. My name is Willow Hetrick. I'm the Executive Director of Chugach Regional Resources Commission. And on the line with me today, I also have Rachel Fisher. She's a VISTA volunteer, but she's much more than that. She's our research scientist, and she does all things wetlands and many other things as well. So today we're going to be presenting to you on the development of Chugach Regional Resources Commission's wetland program plan and some other wetland planning that we're undertaking in our region. So first, I'm going to give you a brief overview of us. We are Chugach Regional Resources Commission, and we abbreviate ourselves as CIRC, or sometimes CRRC. We are an intertribal consortia that serves 7 Alaska Native villages in South Central Alaska. And so as Marcia was just talking about, we are funded under Track 2 because tribal consortia are only eligible under this program for Track 2. We were formed in 1984 by those 7 tribes to focus on natural resource management and subsistence foods and everything environmental. We have 2 sister organizations that focus on housing, which is the North Pacific Rim Housing Authority, and then health and social services, which is Chugach. We also manage and operate the Alutiiq Pride Shellfish Hatchery, which is located in Seward, Alaska, and we do tons of stuff there. Shellfish, finfish, ocean acidification, water quality monitoring. We're starting to raise oysters. We do king crab and blue king crab, and also have started raising kelp. Here's a quick map of our region. You can see that we're a little complicated in that we extend into Lower Cook Inlet and then also the entirety of Prince William Sound. Once we start getting into Lower Cook Inlet, we have a very different ecosystem, and as the regional organization, that sometimes presents some challenges. Our tribes are the native village of Nanwalek, the Tutitlik Village IRA Council, the native village of Eyak, which is located in Cordova, Port Graham Village Council, the Chiniga IRA Council, and the Chugach Native Tribe, which is located in beautiful Seward, Alaska, and the Valdez Native Tribe in beautiful Valdez. And we have some of our tribal members here with us today, so thank you for being with us. In 2019, CIRC applied for the EPA Wetland Program Development Grant that Marcia was just talking about, and we were funded. We were very, very thankful. So we have focused on the EPA core elements, and have been developing our plan. It will, as Marcia said, this plan, once developed, will allow us to apply for further funding to implement some of the very specific information that we're pulling from our community members right now. And we're going to have overarching goals for the wetland program plan, but then also in each individual tribe or community, we're going to focus on some of the issues that are very important to that particular tribe. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. She's going to present a few slides, and I'll be right here and be back with you.
All right, thanks, Willow. So Alaska wetlands are critical to a lot of wildlife species, particularly migratory birds. 37 species of waterfowl, including 30 different species of duck populations, rely on wetland ecosystems, and they serve as a breeding ground for 80% of the world's trumpeter swans, 50% of the world's tundra swans, and 6 out of 11 subspecies of Canada geese. So these wetlands hold a lot of importance, not only to wildlife, but also to humans, specifically tribal members for subsistence harvesting success, and lastly, they're valued for recreation opportunities across the state of Alaska. And wetland loss in Alaska is currently minimal, with about 0.1% loss of total wetlands. But that is concentrated to urban areas. So in these areas, rates of wetland loss are similar to those nationwide. In the Anchorage Bowl, wetland loss is about 50%, and in Juneau, 1/3 of all freshwater wetlands have been lost. And there are many reasons for wetland loss, like human activity, development, but climate change is also a big driver of this. And in some areas, we do note that you might see some more wetlands being created, such as when glaciers are receding. And we can move on to the next slide. And so there are a lot of different types of wetlands in the region, and those include coastal wetlands, which are very productive. Only a small portion of these are vegetated, but they are important as they house salt-tolerant vegetation, which means that the water is saline or brackish water with an abundance of nutrients due to tidal mixing in the area. These types of wetlands are crucial habitat for migratory birds, as we saw just how many species rely on them, and juvenile fish as well. Examples of coastal habitats include salt marshes, mud flats, and eelgrass beds. Typical land formations include estuaries, lagoons, and deltas like the Copper River Delta in the picture above. Freshwater marshes are also found in deltas, but not exclusively. They are generally shallow basins and exist where water collects in shallow depressions. These could include ex-glaciers gouge holes as they flow over bedrock, and when they recede, these holes become exposed. These holes collect and hold water from precipitation, groundwater, lakes, and streams. And the movement of rivers over time leave behind abandoned channels called oxbow lakes as well, and those develop into marshes as they fill in. And lastly, riparian. These wetlands are generally comprised of river connections, ponds, stream channels, and gravel bars. They're often created by seasonal flooding and shallow groundwater. These systems require seasonal flooding events and spring breakup to recharge the area. And this flooding nourishes the riparian wetlands when a lot of organic debris, rich in nutrients, kind of overflow into the stream banks. When these rivers are not flooding, riparian wetlands might drain back into streams, returning the nutrients that eventually flow into estuaries. And these systems include shrubby riparian wetlands with willows, birches, and alder, which are important to Alaska wildlife species. Songbirds also feed and nest in willows during summer, and moose feed on willow during the summer and the winter. They also provide food for fish. Many fish rely indirectly on riparian areas for food because decomposing leaves from plants are an important energy source for aquatic invertebrates that later serve as a food source for fish. And decaying salmon carcasses provide marine-derived nutrients to riparian areas as well. So a lot of different types that serve a lot of different functions. And we can move on to the next slide. And so this figure on the right shows a clip of the National Wetland Inventory layer at Chugach, which is one of the communities that CERC serves over in the Prince William Sound. And this is a prime example of the NWI layer's inaccuracy, as the Chugach Bay town site is not a wetland, but is dirt roads and home sites, and it's the site of a community. And so some of the objectives of this project that we're working on is building the capacity of tribal managers to prioritize restoration management and acquisition opportunities, as well as having a comprehensive plan in place to help make management decisions when those arise. And some of the milestones we've defined are obtaining the NWI wetland GIS data on tribally owned lands and cataloging this data in ArcMap for future data analysis when that's needed. Conducting outreach to the tribes to understand local wetland management concerns and desires, and creating a wetland program plan for our member tribes.
All right, so this map that's shown here is a preliminary map that we have developed along with a contractor that we are using to create this wetland program plan and do some other wetland planning. It shows the boundary line, which you can see in red, dotted red line here, that we're going to be doing our wetland program plan. This is a combination of the Chugach Alaska Corporation corporate boundary plus game management units, which are defined by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and those are Unit 6, which is in the Eak Cordova area, Unit 7, which is in Prince William Sound, or Kenai Peninsula, and Unit 15, which is in Kenai Peninsula as well. And Unit 6 also is part of the central Prince William Sound. So this large area was recently decided upon by our board of directors in our March 25th meeting that we had. We had presented them several different options for a wetland program plan boundary. And of course, they wanted the most comprehensive one, which is what the staff wanted as well. So we're very happy with that. So it's within this boundary that we're gonna focus our wetland program plan efforts. And one of the major goals of our organization and some of the themes that we've been hearing from surveys that Rachel's gonna talk about soon is that we need to have more refined we need to have more refined data than the NWI wetland layer that is shown here. Now I will mention that we haven't included every single wetland in the NWI layer because that would be a very incredibly busy map. Right here we have shown estuarine and marine wetlands and then freshwater wetlands. And there are many different layers. It's very technical. This is just a brief overview that shows you how extensive wetlands are in the South Central region in particular. So far, thanks to Sydney, we've been able to gather data from the Kenai Peninsula Borough, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Park Service, and the National Park Service. And along with our GIS contractor who created this map for us, we are going to be putting all of those data layers together in one comprehensive location so that land managers and particularly us in our region can determine where the wetlands are for planning purposes. As Rachel had highlighted earlier, there are several projects that are really important to the region that could cause wetland loss, recreation of a new airport that will service Port Graham and Nanwalek. There's always continued expansion in the communities. We need to understand if those expansions are affecting wetlands and what that means for the tribe in terms of Army Corps of Engineer permitting. Also, there's discussions of a hard rock mine near Tutitlik, and so we just want our tribes to be armed with the information that they need to make good decisions. So one of our most lofty goals, which is not supported as part of this grant, but our end goal for all of this is to make this data available online to everybody who needs to plan in the region. And of course, refining the data as well. So back to Rachel.
All right, thanks, Will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey that we have put out. And you'll recall that one of the milestones for this project a couple slides back was to conduct outreach to tribes to understand local wetland management concerns and desires. In order to accomplish this, we decided on a survey platform to garner community input, paired with in-person outreach when we would visit the communities for different projects. And this digital platform has worked out quite well for us recently, seeing that travel to communities or to rural communities is very limited at the time. And so in this survey, I included a page or two on education on what wetlands are, why they're important, what they look like here in Alaska. And then I moved on to asking some questions, asking both open-ended and multiple choice questions that would allow for different levels of specificity and response, and what would allow for different levels of analysis when looking at the responses. And as I go through some of the responses, you'll notice that we mirrored a lot of the EPA language. A lot of what Marcia presented in her presentation is a lot of the language we use just for consistency's sake. And so for the multiple choice section, we found that from the responses, and we've received about 30 so far, and Willow, if you don't mind typing my email into the chat box, if anybody is interested in taking this, please shoot me an email. I will send you the link. It's very quick. It does not take a long time, and it would really help us out. For this multiple choice section, we found that voluntary restoration and protection was prioritized as the highest action, regulation coming second, water quality standards being third, and monitoring and assessment being fourth. And then further, we asked about specific activities under each category, and we found that the ones I've listed are the ones that were the most prioritized under each category. So removing invasive species and planting native vegetation, or just any sort of invasive species perspective, was prioritized as the highest. Protecting wetlands for subsistence resources. This is something we see consistently and across the board being prioritized by our communities. Developing water quality standards that are specific to important species in the region that rely on wetlands. So again, bringing it back to the subsistence species that are very important to this region. And then just general monitoring and assessment of the health of wetlands in the region. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. The open-ended questions that the survey asks gives participants a space to let us know about work that they'd like to see that we haven't yet thought of or proposed. And so these responses include coastal community health, which related the health of coastlines and aquatic wetlands to the health of the people in the region. In these responses, we also saw the importance that people placed on wetlands because they're home to wildlife, which are also considered subsistence and food sources that I mentioned before. And then again, that connection between environmental health and the mental, physical, emotional health of people in this region. And under the actions that we saw most desired are increasing education on wetlands, what they do, why they're important, and protecting and monitoring from shoreline erosion. So those are two major points. And then again, at the bottom, we see that subsistence resources are consistently prioritized. So not only making sure that these wetlands are protected to remain an important habitat and ecosystem, but making space for subsistence use in political landscapes while continuing to regulate other development in wetlands. So that is a very important point that we saw from the survey so far. And our last slide, if we move on one. We asked this question before we had, agreed to do this webinar or really spoke with Sydney. And so one of the responses on the last slide that kind of brings this whole presentation full circle, the increased education is an important step in protecting wetlands in this region. Before we can increase education, it's kind of pertinent to have an accurate and comprehensive mapping of wetlands in the state. And so we saw that Chugach, a community with homes, a school, infrastructure, just an entire community of people, comes up on the map as wetlands. And we don't want any community, any people, anybody's priorities to be overlooked because of inaccurate mapping data. And so moving forward with wetland protection, subsistence use, shoreline erosion mitigation, conservation, whatever the activity is, it's important to have this kind of comprehensive and at least slightly more accurate mapping data. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Willow.
Okay, everyone, if I put a little note in the chat box for you, if you're interested, if you're from the Chugach region, sorry to be exclusive here, but this wetland program plan in particular is for the 7 tribes in Chugach, and you're interested in taking the survey or know someone who's interested in taking the survey, you can email myself or Rachel. Here's our contact information, and this will be available for in the slides when we send it out. You can also visit our website to get a hold of us, and you can also get a hold of us on Facebook.